Conversation between
Ptaah
and
Zafenatpaneach
from the Pleiadian Federation, as well as
Yanarara
from Sonara, Timar from the DAL universe, and Billy Eduard Albert Meier, Beam. 765th Contact Wednesday, February 3, 2021, 10:57 p.m. Translated with DeepL.com. Disclaimer: this is an unofficial translation and will contain errors. This version is missing parts from the PDF in which it was taken from.
Edward, unfortunately it took a little longer, but now I am back. I am glad to see you well. Greetings, dear friend. Yanarara and Zafenatpaneach will also come by, because they have a lot to explain to you. Quetzal will also come here, but he is still out in the field.
Aha, then there's a bit of business. Welcome and greetings, my friend. While you were away, time was neither too short nor too long for me, because in the last few weeks everything was so criss-cross that there was no boredom. With my computer and with everything that happened in the office, it was effectively ashen, because everything went crazy. Several times there were also witnesses who could not grasp or comprehend what they witnessed and experienced. Well, everyone is given something to deal with. But it was strange for me that you didn't come here for such a long time, because in the last few months your visits were more frequent than ever before, which is probably the reason why I felt so strange. Because somehow you miss a person with whom you can maintain a good friendship after only a short time.
Interesting, because for my part, too, I was moved by similar thoughts and feelings, which had never excited me in this way before. I also felt strange about my morals, because it was as if I had lost something very significant.
You describe it exactly right. Because this is how everything has effectively worked out, and also in other ways, in which evil was also involved, but which I don't want to talk about openly, because other people. Well, I can explain it to you later in secrecy, if you want then.
Although I am not curious, I see an emotion in your eyes and hear it in your voice.
Unfortunately, it does not pass without a trace. Especially when the mind cannot rest. Here, look at this report. It says that the WHO is now allegedly conducting research in China to find the origin of the corona epidemic. What they will do, however, will be nothing more than pro forma bungling, as Firth and I have observed in the future, and on the other hand, because they will not find out anything, because they cannot find out anything. They will simply claim mendaciously that the corona disease originated from bats, only that it cannot be explained how the disease was transmitted from them to humans. And if I remember correctly, they claimed that the virus was probably carried by an intermediate host or something and transmitted to humans.
Yes, that's how my father wrote it down in his annals. As I read in it, you went back to the whole epidemic period again and also observed how ridiculous. Father wrote it like that, and ignorant of the facts as well as ignorant of research the WHO carried out its alleged clarifications, or will do so now in the present time in the next few days. That the actual origin.
No, please don't, because Firth said that it should not be talked about. But only the most important things should be said informatively, and that only concerned certain information of the necessary behavior and safety measures, especially with regard to respirators and dealing with fellow human beings. As far as authorship is concerned, that should not be mentioned openly, you know that.
However, certain information would be useful in him.
No, unfortunately it doesn't work. Because one way or another nothing can be changed. What has already happened in the future, as observed in advance, is equally true in the present and cannot be changed, just as everything that has happened in the past cannot be changed, because what has already happened cannot be changed. This is the case regardless of whether it is something that has happened in the past or whether it is an event that has been observed in the future and that is now actually happening in the present as it was observed in the future some 70 years ago.
What my father's faith has recorded in his annals about what you two observed at that time, it should be possible to give certain information about that and, moreover, it should be helpful for the prevention of further mischief.
Of course, it could be possible, but that must not be considered, which is why Sfirth commanded me to keep quiet about it, because, well, I can really only explain that to you in secrecy.
Please, yes.
Good, but really only under secrecy.
Yes. But, Edward, I'm not involved in your confidentiality, so I could.
No, my friend. You know, even if Sfirth has obviously omitted to mention that nothing should be announced about this by third parties, my word of silence, which I gave him, applies to me. And if I have told you one thing or another, then it was because on the one hand, as Sfirth's son, you are continuing his work, then. Well, and on the other hand, I only informed you in the confidence that you too, as Sfirth's heir, are also bound by the same duties, promises and rules, etc., which also impose on you the duty to remain silent, because you have somehow inherited all the duties and are continuing them, thus also the silence. That, I think, should.
I should consider. Well, please don't. Sorry. As old as I have become. But what you say. Yes, it is right. Still at my age I have to be taught. But information would be in hin.
Leave it, please, there's no need for that. You know, I too often feel the need to say more, on the one hand, what shall we talk about it? It's just the way it is, and that can't be changed. And what has happened so far is that, as a result of the incompetence of all the governments of the world, as well as the cross-minded, cross-thinkers, know-it-alls and conspiracy theorists who make up about 1/3 of the people, the whole thing corresponds to a worldwide epidemic catastrophe, as was always the case in earlier times. So the whole of the fact that the pandemic could arise at all is, as always, the fault of the people themselves, the incompetent rulers and the 1/3 part of the stupid and impudent troublemakers of the population, who are basically to blame for the death of many people and who, in their lack of conscience, do not give it a second thought. The absolutely inadequate and confusing things that have happened so far with regard to the corona epidemic can be traced back on the one hand to the inept rulers who have always been incapable and are still incapable of properly combating such crises as epidemics. Until today, due to stupidity or non-thinking, they have never learned to create the right security measures in accordance with the basic law and the Constitution, to take such measures and to have them enforced by virtue of the state constitution with regard to health and safety for the good of the people through the deployment of all necessary security and law and order organs. This is because they are just as incapable of asserting themselves against all the obstructionism of the obstructionists, who, in complete stupidity and thus as a result of their inability to think, demonstratively invoke inadequate basic rights and destroy private as well as state property, as they are against the economic powers, the cults of divine faith as well as the big and small businessmen, etc. On the other hand, however, it is also that part of the population itself, that of the stupid and the ricocheting, which always amounts to between 20 and 30%, from which terror is always made and disaster is always conjured up, which always leads to many deaths through their fault. But to talk further about this would be futile and pointless. Therefore, please look here, this handwritten letter is pleasing. It is a letter from a friend which he wrote to me last week and which I want to read to you.
Dear Billy, happy birthday. I would like to thank you for every single minute of your life. Through your work and help, it is possible for us to create heaven on earth. Thank you very much. I don't want to mention his name, but look here, you can read it. It would probably not be right for him if I mentioned his name, and besides, I would have to ask him first if I wanted to mention his name. But look here, these are all such letters, as well as letters like this one, which says, but read it yourself.
It is distressing that such people cannot find help from professionals, but only obtain it when they find their way to you.
If the psychologists and psychiatrists send people into the desert instead of dealing with their problems and explaining to them what and how they themselves have to do the right thing to get their psyche back on track, then the suffering people cannot work themselves out of their thought-feeling psyche swamp. But I don't really want to talk about that, I just want to show you these letters.
But it has proved to be interesting. But it would also be interesting if the people concerned who have experienced various strange occurrences in your workroom would write them down. On the one hand, I would like to know how they process the incident within themselves, and on the other hand, it would be interesting for various people if you were to publish the incidents, so that they could be read and possibly help some people. I have already made this request in the past, but so far I have not heard from you that such a testimony has been made in writing.
Yes, I know. I forwarded your wish, but unfortunately nothing came of it anyway. But I will remind people again. But listen to this, a telephone conversation that I recorded with this device, but which I will delete as soon as you have listened to it.
This too is frightening, so it is very good that you have carried out educational work and worked out the need for protective measures against the corona plague, which have also been checked by your proofreading group and then published by your website managers.
Yes, while the two of us don't want to talk anymore about corona, that's what we decided. But look here what I wrote here and what will be sent out to all Figure members worldwide tomorrow and also put on the Figure website.
I see there are 7 pages. It's a bit much to read at the moment, which is why I am only reviewing it briefly and then scanning it to read it thoroughly later. Yes, Edward, this is important information that needs to be published and will be of interest to the people who open your website.
On 23 January I presented it to Floina, and on 26 January also to Quetzal, both of whom also said that people would need this information. But see also this letter, because someone writes that I should give some more information about the corona vaccination and also some explanations about the respiratory masks, about which I only know what I remember from SFAT and have also learned in the present time. Here, too, people ask what is meant by the first, second and third wave of the corona epidemic, and what should be done in principle to make the epidemic disappear. There are also questions about long-term effects and consequences, as well as about what the pathogens are and the difference between bacteria and viruses and between micro and nano. There are also questions about various other things, because there is obviously a great need for information among the population, but the incompetent governments and experts are obviously not capable of providing the necessary explanations. When you read all the questions that are being asked here, then there really is a great need among the people for some explanations, but it will not be possible to explain everything completely, because everything is too extensive.
Reads. Amazing these questions and the ignorance that prevails. Something should effectively be explained about this, which I will gladly do.
You don't have to, because the questions are addressed to me, dear friend, and therefore I am expected to answer them. But if I can't handle it, then I can take the liberty of asking you. And it should also be said that, unfortunately, no one from the incompetent rulers, virologists, epidemiologists and all other illogical liars of all kinds has the idea that the populations want to be enlightened with regard to all the connections of the epidemic in order to understand everything and be able to act accordingly. And since this is not being done, there are many more people who follow the ricochets, know-it-alls and conspiracy theorists, shouting in the streets and causing destruction.
Of course. And answer the questions. That's what you should do, because you're not starting something new regarding the corona plague, which we don't want to talk about anymore, but you're giving explanatory answers to questions that have been raised.
Good, if you say so. What I remember, for example, is that Zafenatpaneach said in the early 1950s that all kinds of future and light respirators, at that time there was still talk of today in terms of the future, would protect against certain aerosols and all kinds of bacteria and microorganisms if worn over the nose and mouth. A start for a special and extremely thin pre-material of such protective masks, a fusible fiber or something, if I remember correctly, which together with another material would be well suited for the production of a good respiratory protection mask, had already been invented in the USA at the beginning of the 1940s. However, this would only be brought together with another material in the GDR in the late 1960s and early 1970s, from which good protective masks would then be made. If I remember correctly, Zafenatpaneach said that a gossamer synthetic fiber was invented by GDR experimenters, which was then brought together to form a spun-bonded fabric or something, and the so-called non-woven fabric was made. From this, he said, and I remember this well, good, valuable and useful non-woven breathing masks were made. Now, as far as respirators that are not attacked by viruses are concerned, in this respect there are really only good protective masks that should be used, such as the commonly used FFP2 and FFP3 masks in this respect. In general, for daily use, the FFP2 masks without an exhalation valve are actually common and useful, which, according to earthly test results, are supposed to prevent approximately 94% coronaviruses from entering the mask and thus into the breathing zone of the human being, although you are talking about only approximately 92 to 93% safety. These FFP2 masks are usually fitted with ear-retaining rubber, while suitable FFP3 masks, which according to earthly data are supposed to prevent 96% and according to your data about 94% of viruses from entering, also have retaining straps for around the back of the head. The extent to which coronaviruses can penetrate a protective mask and reach the breathing zone of humans, while other pathogens and pollutants are prevented up to 96% from penetrating this mask quality, depends on the type of mask and the mask quality, whereby FFP2 and FFP3 are the most common half masks, after which only full face masks etc. are given. The danger with regard to aerosols, however, does not lie in the fact that they can penetrate from the outside through masks into the interior and thus into the breathing zone of humans, because FFP2 and FFP3 respiratory protection masks can provide good protection against aerosols. The effective danger factor is of a different kind. Namely that aerosols contaminated with viruses are discharged into the free air or
open, break open,
or
burst open,
and thus release the virus. Zafenatpaneach explained the whole thing to me at the beginning of the 1950s and also let me see in his screen equipment how aerosols containing viruses burst open and the viruses then floated around freely in the air for a very long time and were also swirled around in the air by the wind. This fact makes it particularly obvious that viruses can also be inhaled through unsuitable masks, because the viruses are X times smaller than the aerosols that are prevented from penetrating by good masks. In this day and age of corona grating, the wearing of good and tested respiratory masks is just as urgently necessary for the sake of health as keeping a distance from one person to another outside the immediate family circle. This is contrary to all the lies and misleading assertions of know-it-alls, troublemakers, contrarians, conspiracy theorists and those who do not think and knock on basic rights and live under the delusion that curfews would restrict freedom and only correspond to official terrorist measures. This delusion, however, is complete nonsense, because curfews serve to prevent the spread of the disease and thus protect the lives of many fellow human beings. In today's corona pandemic, respiratory masks are an urgent necessity and are an integral part of the protective concept of every individual who takes responsibility. And this is necessary both in everyday life at work and in leisure time, and without exception when dealing with people who do not belong to the healthy and closest family circle, whereby a minimum distance of 1.5 to 2 meters from them must also be the rule. And on top of all this, I would like to say the following: wearing respirators as a defense against pathogens against the corona epidemic corresponds to a duty towards one's own and any other life. Respirators usually correspond to half masks that cover the mouth and nose and thus the lower part of the face, thereby protecting the person wearing the mask from harmful aerosols, toxins, particles and microorganic pathogens that are filtered out by the masks. Such particle filtering half masks generally correspond to tested products that are commercially available with the designation FFP1, FFP2 and FFP3, where FFP stands for
face filtering piece,
and describes masks that are circumferentially made of filtering material and manufactured in such a way that they cover the part of the face from the nose over the mouth to the chin. If, with regard to the corona epidemic, personal responsibility or a legally prescribed obligation to wear a respiratory protection mask is specified, then masks of the FFP2 or FFP3 type should generally be used. These can be used with or without a breathing valve, whereby masks with a valve offer the advantage of simplified breathing, but expel used breathing air through the valve and thus possibly also any pathogens present if the person wearing the mask is ill. The wearing of respirators should not only be an adequate protection and a necessary precaution, but also an effective protection for one's own life, as well as for the environment and other people. Therefore, only breathing masks without a valve should be worn. This is because, effectively, a person wearing a mask with a valve only poses no risk of infection to the environment and other people if he or she is absolutely healthy and therefore does not exhale any pathogens through the mask valve. Personal protection against pathogens should require that fellow human beings and the environment are also sufficiently protected. Consequently, in the case of epidemics or other contagious diseases, breathing masks with valves should only be used and worn by persons who are either absolutely healthy and therefore do not exhale any pathogens through the valve, or who are indeed healthy but have severe breathing difficulties when wearing protective masks. Basically, in the case of epidemics or other infectious diseases of any kind, not only one's own protection should be taken into consideration, but also an appropriate protective effect for the environment or for fellow human beings. What I already know from SFAT is that simple respiratory masks do not protect against the coronavirus because viruses exist down to nanoscale levels, but I have forgotten the details and names of the main types of viruses and their sizes. If I try to remember, I can still bring together that Zafeth first spoke of a Pandora virus, also of a herpes virus and of a bacterium and virus or so, as well as of a millionth or micrometer, as well as of billionth or nanoparticles. But I really don't remember the numerical values or the size or the tininess.
I can help you remember. The Pandora virus has the designation and size 1 micrometer or 1 millionth and can be detected with an electron microscope. A bacterium has a size of 1 to 5 micrometers equals microrisp. Myrisp. Millionth equals micrometer, and can be detected with a light microscope. A herpes virus has a size of 200 to 300 nanometers. Nanoparticles equals nanometers and can be detected with an electron microscope. The coronavirus is 120 nanometers tiny equals nanoparticles or nanoparticles. These are associated with a few to a few thousand atoms or molecules, where the term
nano
refers to the tininess, which is 1 to 100 nanometers. Where 1 nanometer equals nm equals 10^9 equals 0.0000001 meters equals 1 billionth of a meter. A parvovirus, as well as a ribosome, have a tininess of 20 nanometers equals nanometer.
Thank you. I would like to explain that
nano
is derived from their Greek
nanos,
which means
dwarf,
or
dwarf-like,
or for the German language it can be better described as
winzig.
And what I was able to read about nanoparticles was that according to ISO, TS 27687 to 2008, I don't know what that means. Nano-objects are particles that have 3 external dimensions, whatever that means. But that is not important for understanding that nanoparticles are extremely tiny and simple protective masks do not stop coronaviruses, but can therefore penetrate through the masks and be inhaled by humans. All self-made masks are unsuitable and useless in this respect and offer no protection whatsoever.
1. Fabric masks of all kinds.
2. Neckerchiefs.
3. Handkerchiefs and other tissues.
4. Face shields of all kinds.
5. FFP1 masks. Only high-quality FFP2 and FFP3 respirators can offer the highest possible protection against viruses from the size of 1 to 5 micrometers millionth equals micrometer of bacteria to
nm,
or nanoparticles. New.
Excuse me, but I would like to mention our test results, which are extremely precise and highly superior to all earthly and even highly technical possibilities in this respect and which are not yet available for exactly precise results. According to our research, findings and results, these results only show a safety of 92.6% for the FFP2 protective masks mentioned by you and only 94.3% for FFP3 with regard to the impermeability of COVID-19.
Thank you. You have told me this before, which I should also mention. But I just wanted to mention the earthly data which supposedly can guarantee 94% safety for the FFP2 masks and 96% for the FFP3, but above all not 99%, as is falsely propagated, thereby misleading people and lulling them into a false sense of security. This is what is being done with vaccines, which have not yet been thoroughly tested and their effective efficacy has not been verified, so that these actual and necessary tests are only now being carried out and the necessary knowledge gained through the mass vaccinations and the experience to be gained from them. This, however, is not disclosed to those willing to be vaccinated, just as it is not disclosed that the effectiveness of various vaccines is being lied about and that, contrary to claims of lies to the contrary, they do not have equally positive effects on all corona mutations. It is also concealed that certain vaccines have no effect at all for certain reasons, which means that vaccinated people are infected with the coronavirus despite vaccination and can therefore also die from the epidemic. As far as small and large viruses are concerned, I found this list here, which briefly describes which factors influence the size and tininess of viruses, or how large and small viruses differ. It also lists the factors that also influence the size of viruses: genome, DNA or RNA, proteins, pathogenicity factors on the viral envelope, as written here.
Large viruses.
Large genome, viral proteins, viral enzymes, for example herpes viruses, themselves encode many enzymes for nucleic acid metabolism and can therefore replicate in practically all phases of the cell cycle because more mutations. Largest DNA genomes, 2,500,000, because DNA polymerases have a proofreading function, stable copying of the genome, except coronaviruses, RNA polymerase with proofreading function role. Stable replication of the 30 kilobit RNA genome.
Small viruses equals dependence on the host cell.
Small genome, only with the most necessary. Remains under the radar of the cell. Largest RNA genomes, 30,000 bases. No repair function, possibly advantageous, better adaptation, but the no longer possible above 10 kilobits due to accumulation of too many mutations. Genome stability.
Stronger dependence on cellular mechanisms, for example papilloma or host cell dependence. Parvoviruses, host cell must be in S phase. Small dependence on host cell mechanisms can better respond to host and environmental conditions or inactivate host defense mechanisms.
The other questions I can answer relate to what we have already explained several times since the emergence of the corona epidemic, that the epidemic will cause millions of deaths as a result of the incompetence of the rulers and the cross-dressing of about 1/3 of the population and the addiction of the people to pleasure, travel, feasting, sport and the urge to get out of their homes. In this respect, people live, come what may, thoughtlessly, irresponsibly and senselessly into the day and do not consider in any way certain precautionary and safety rules that should be observed. But since the incompetent rulers are sick in the same hospital and can neither think nor therefore know what really has to be done, it follows that they are not a role model for the populations, but failures who are treated in the same way. And the questions here, what really has to be done? In my opinion, there is only strict compliance and the enforcement of unavoidable security and precautionary measures, which should not only be observed, but should be enforced against all ignorance, all unreason and all low intellect of those incompetent rulers and parts of the population by the deployment of effectively loyal security forces. To do this, a plan would have to be drawn up and followed, which your fathers Fifth and I had thought about, and if this had been implemented at the beginning of the epidemic, then the corona epidemic would have died within 2 to 3 months before it could have degenerated into a pandemic. However, I do not want to talk about this plan, because firstly, those authoritative rulers who are self-important, arrogant and obsessed with power do not listen to the concerns of the people anyway, and consequently no plan and proposal is followed, and secondly, as a rule around 1/3 of the people always crosses the line, so that what is necessary and right cannot be implemented, and the rest of the population then has to suffer and accept damage and even death. However, as far as the question of what should be done first and foremost is concerned, there are a few important points that I would like to mention as follows, which are urgently necessary to implement, but which are not being implemented by the lame rulers and the stupid and impudent 1/3 of the population.
1. The compulsory wearing of suitable respiratory masks of FFP2 or FFP3 quality, as required, in unavoidable contact with people outside the strictly personal living area.
2. Compulsory keeping of distance from person to person and unavoidable contact with fellow human beings outside the strictly personal living area.
3.
Close under
or strict lockdown or total curfew, except for matters such as food shopping, emergencies and health care related to medicine, doctor, hospital, energy needs, but controlled overall within responsible limits by security agencies.
4. Curfew violations by the unteachable should be punished with severe penalties and long-term quarantine.
5. Absolute strict prohibition of any kind of traveling, public entertainment, sports events, events for pleasure and other non-essential activities of any kind, religious events such as visits to churches, mosques, temples, synagogues and religious circles, etc., as well as learning, teaching and school activities. 6. General suspension of work in all enterprises that are not vital for the populations, in accordance with certain extensive regulations concerning the avoidance of financial damage, regulation of rent and lease obligations, etc.
7. Drafting fundamental rights laws that are also designed for emergency situations and are to be followed by the populations, such as in crises, epidemics and pandemics, times of emergency, countrywide or worldwide natural disasters, etc.
As far as the measures regarding curfews and a total lockdown are concerned, the responsible rulers and part of the population are completely irresponsible, namely because as soon as the contagion situation improves somewhat, lockdowns are immediately relaxed again, whereby the whole contagion can strike again from the beginning. This is an absolutely idiotic and irresponsible action, which leads to thousands of infections and costs thousands of lives. But as long as incompetent rulers sit at the helm of the state, palavering stupidly and imbecilically, hoping for help from an imaginary god and sneaking around the asses of the economic powers that be and doing what they want, nothing will change for the right and sensible. Similarly, nothing will change for the better and the good if the third of the population's lunatics and madmen, stupid and impudent as well as querulous, know-it-all and conspiracy-believing people are not stopped and not put off course, who in many cases also spread the disease through their pathologically imbecilic behavior. That is one part of the story. But on top of that one is attacked and insulted in a stupid way or even taken to court if one tells the truth about what is actually going on and points out how stupidly stupid the troublemakers and troublemakers behave and act on the one hand, and on the other hand, how incompetent and short-sighted the rulers are and have no idea of what has to be done effectively in order to counteract the corona epidemic properly. In fact, one must be glad that one is not dragged before the caddy and punished by inadequate laws if one speaks the truth in public, as is the case especially when I denounce the incompetence, loudmouthed and stupidity of those in power without attacking any particular government person with insulting words.
That could only be if you were attacking a person personally and calling them foul names, which is not the case if you are just being decorous in general about their inability to govern.
I'm not so sure about that, because as has always been the case in my life, the authorities etc. are not well disposed towards me. Oh well, there's no point in talking about it anyway. To all that has been said, very extensive explanations would still be necessary, but it would take too much time to go into them now, so I can only briefly touch on the 7 points mentioned and not explain them further. I would also like to briefly address the question that is being asked about the first, second and third wave, because an explanation is obviously necessary, because there is no need for a
To must have told you we were coming. Greetings, my friend. Yanarara, I join you in this. Greetings, dear friend. But do not be disturbed in your conversation, for we are in no hurry and wish to wait.
Ptaah actually said you were still coming here. Welcome and greetings to both of you. And if you are not in a hurry, I would like to finish what I was about to start.
Don't let that stop you.
Thank you. So, if there is talk of a first, second and third wave of the corona epidemic, then this is obviously completely misunderstood. Overall, it should be understood that the individual waves are not several, but effectively only a single wave or a swell, as is the case in all freshwaters, streams, rivers and lakes, as well as in all oceans. Such a swell results depending on the subsoil, the depth of the water, the strength of movement in the case of seaquakes, as in the case of wind and storm lashes on the water, which then results in a swell, which results in a wave sequence that produces asymmetrical waves. This means that a wave disparity arises in such a way that different wave sizes are created, which never have exactly the same wave height, because depending on the origin, there is a constant up and down in this respect, and in between a larger wave can also arise again, depending on which forces of motion cause the swell. As a rule, this cannot be seen by the naked eye, because humans are generally not trained for such natural phenomena and also usually walk blindly or half-blindly through the world, have no eye open for nature and therefore see nothing. Well, as with the water wave, the whole thing also results with the corona plague or with other things, because basically it is always the same wave, but not a new wave when one rises again and becomes stronger or bigger, etc. So it is no more and no less always just the same widening swell, which, however, from time to time in a single wave becomes higher and stronger again through some circumstances, in order to then collapse again and
normalize,
so to speak. And this is exactly what brings about the same effect with the corona plague, whereby the becoming of a new wave usually results from the unreasonableness and wrong behavior of people by disregarding the protective measures against the plague.
It's amazing how you always know how to explain something so that it can be understood.
If you say so, thank you. What I have here now, Ptaah, is something else. An article sent to me by Joachim Wolf concerning vaccination against the corona epidemic. If you would like to skim it briefly.
Reads. Well, really just
skim
over it because it's a bit rambling, but I will skim it. What I have read briefly, I will talk to you about later when I have read it completely. But now I will go, because Yanarara and Zafenatpaneach have a lot to tell you, after which Quetzal will probably appear.
Okay, but what do you think? This morning the police showed up at the center, drove past, turned around in the large sweeping area at the back and drove away again. They didn't stop and say anything or ask any questions. What do you think?
I know that in Switzerland there was a ban on assemblies etc., which is probably why they checked whether you were complying with this at the center. Although I am also concerned about the extent to which the police controlled your center, which is remote from the village, at their own discretion.
Aha, so you too. We also thought that someone had intervened as a result of revenge and hatred, because we had taken steps to prevent people from sneaking around the center at any time of the day or night and spying through the windows.
I am aware of that, so I also thought. Yes, you caught my guess. And that Quetzal went out of his way to instruct you on a surveillance system that you now have in use. That was the right decision.
It was, but it cost us a lot, because the whole thing was not exactly cheap. But it has brought us benefits, which we are all happy about, because we now have peace from spying, which, however, has obviously not been answered with joy by certain people, but now with police control.
That's how I judge it too. But now, Edward, I will go. Goodbye, dear friend. And let yourself be surprised by what Yanarara and
have to report.
Goodbye, my friend, goodbye. Ptaah.
Before we come to what has come up with regard to all our investigations that we have been painstakingly carrying out over the last few years to clarify the strange occurrences in your workroom and with regard to your work, etc., I have something to disclose to you that you do not know because it has been forgotten to disclose it to you, but you should know it. I want to do this now because Pleiadian brought it to my attention the other day on behalf of Zamjace. As early as 1980, Zamjace reported to me that on the 27th of May 1979, you and Guido contacted Wendell Stevens in America or in an area far outside the city of Tucson, with whom you had already communicated frequently via telephone system, but about which you both remained silent until the end of his life, as well as about the fact that Guido was involved in this incident, that he also knew Wendell Stevens and was allowed to fly in Zamjace's aircraft. Wendell Stevens guided you that Sunday to another area called Death Valley, where you had already been with Svath and can boast an experience that no other person is likely to have in the same way. If I start again from the beginning, the reason for the whole thing was because you had told Guido a strange thing and he was interested in it. Consequently, he wanted to see the place and the traces of the phenomenon that happens in that desert area from time to time. When you informed Zamjace of Guido's interest, which urged him to at least see and enter the place and question himself and also to meet Wendell Stevens, Zamjace agreed to fly him with you in their aircraft to Death Valley in America and also to include Wendell Stevens, which is how it turned out. Because I myself was also interested in this natural phenomenon, which I could never personally observe in its activity, I installed a small monitoring system high above the area in question, on the basis of which long-term recordings were made, according to which I was able to actually observe the recorded phenomenon after a long time. This phenomenon was unknown to us, and therefore very interesting for us. Our long-term recordings prove to us a phenomenon such as is not known to us anywhere, nor do any records exist about it, except those that must have been listed by Svath, as you explained to, but which he has not yet found in the Svath annals.
Aha, but he will surely find it, because Svath always took everything very precisely. Consequently, I think he also noted this thing explicitly. It was interesting for me, too, and I like to remember well when Svath, it was in the 1940s, 1948 or 1949 or so, brought me to Death Valley after a rainstorm because he wanted to show me
wandering
boulders to let me witness a strange natural phenomenon. In addition, I remember that the rain was followed by freezing cold, which caused the desert floor to freeze on the surface, but then the ground became muddy and violent gale-force winds arose. Crazy as it seemed to me, the heavy boulders then started moving due to the violent winds and slid across the ground, driven only by the storm wind. When I sat down on one of the heavy boulders, some of which weighed several hundred kilos, as Svath told me at the time, I effectively had to cling to it and hold on tightly, otherwise the storm wind would have simply swept me away. But since I clung to the boulder with all my might and apparently, as Svath said, provided an additional wind-driving surface with my back, the wind drove the boulder and me across the icy muddy ground.
When I was told about the phenomenon in 1980, I had doubts about it, but I had no possibility to check it, which is why I did not let it rest after the story and installed a monitoring system high above the area, which then monitored the whole thing for 4 years and produced registrations, the records of which confirmed all the statements and accounts.
You see, my friend, there is nothing like verification, which is why everything must always be questioned and clarified in order to find out what is true or untrue, what is wrong or right. But with that, the whole thing is clear.
That so far, yes, but there are some questions on Yanarara's mind and mine regarding the globally spreading plague, if we can talk to you about it. For our part, Billy and I have decided not to raise this issue anymore, or only if there is an urgent need to do so.
But this does not concern Zafenatpaneach and me.
Of course not. I only said what to and I decided together. But if you want to talk and ask about it, it doesn't concern both of you. If you have misunderstood me, then...
I did indeed. I apologize, I thought too hastily.
No problem, and so no apology is necessary. Sometimes the tongue is just a little faster than the thoughts, and that can happen to anyone when they are preoccupied with something and cannot quickly enough switch off the current thought and direct it to a new thought that has to deal with something else. If this happens, then the tongue reacts faster than the consciousness can react, and a new thought can be formed before the tongue reacts automatically, so to speak.
How you always know how to explain something quickly and accurately. It is amazing and brings soothing at the same time.
Thank you. It's probably just force of habit.
Number?
Question mark.
You don't think about it, I see it. You appease because you don't want to seem. You consciously control what you say.
I agree.
If you say so, but may I now ask what your questions are? Zafenatpaneach? Yes, we think so, even though you are transitioning. Please. Such discussions are pointless. We should talk about what you want to ask, because Quetzal is on his way to our premises, after which he will also want to come here and will probably have a lot to report.
Talking about you is really useless, I know, but... No, what you say is right. Then I want to ask to what extent your knowledge of the plague is prior? Zafenatpaneach, and I have no knowledge of it because our fields of work are not related to it, but we are interested in it.
Yes, your system of behavior in relation to your duties is strictly separate. I know that, which is why you do not concern yourselves with things that affect other people's areas of work. But I have something to say about that I think is important before I go into the question about the plague.
You have been asked, and you answer. And if you think that something else needs to be explained first, then so be it.
Good, thank you. I find your Pleiadian system of strictly separated spheres of work good and logical, because it prevents differences from arising through improper or other interference. Unfortunately, this is not the case here on Earth. For Earthlings everywhere are always interfering in the affairs of their fellow human beings, although their actions and behavior are none of their business. This creates quarrels over and over again, leading to hatred, violence and even murder and manslaughter. This is the case in all strata of the population of all peoples on the entire globe, whereby this insane principle also or even especially prevails in governments, and specifically in the state powers of the Western countries, such as the USA, Germany and the entire EU dictatorship, which should basically clean up their own mess, establish order and learn to do the right thing. On the contrary, however, they interfere in the affairs of other states and thus create strife and discord. Push everything to the point of enmity, as has been done for some time now, especially by the German government, its politicians, as well as by the entire EU dictatorship pack in Brussels and their union dictators of the annexed states, as well as the lunatics of the USA, who harass and insult Russia, above all Putin. This in order to free the effective criminal, Nawalny, a man whom all the stupid people of the world adore and do not realize what kind of malicious, foul-playing and power-obsessed as well as devious nature this man actually has in himself, just like in America Trump and certain former and also present despotic types. All these character-windy creatures, in their delusions of grandeur, believe themselves to be better and infallible than those who attack and insult them as they dig around in their character dirt. And in this respect, I am not talking about them as human beings, not even in the case of Nawalny, but about their dirty character creatures and their dirty character behavior, which is just as characteristic of them as it has been of all like-minded people since time immemorial. Exactly what I am talking about, however, is something that certain people apparently do not want to or cannot grasp, because they either lack the will to think about the whole thing in depth, or they may lack the necessary intelligence to think about everything and recognize the real reality from it and also accept it. This then leads to complaints being made and my explanation being described as
impure,
etc., with which I explain by way of introduction on our website that I am not objecting to and attacking the person and not his personality, but only his wrong, low and deviant character attitude and the degenerations resulting from it. And this fact is the best proof that this is indeed the case, that no logical consideration is given to anything, that no thought is given to it, and that it is only talked about in a frivolous manner. Elizabeth faxed it to me today and it proves in black and white what I have just said, that people only talk and write, but do not really think about anything and thus do not really fathom the content of speech. And I think exactly on this fax, which I am neither attacking nor malicious or arrogant, but merely expressing as a clear, effective statement and assumption, that the whole content could be based on a lack of logical thinking and reflection, or, from my point of view and judgment, on a lack of reflection, a perhaps false feeling of being attacked in relation to one's own person, or on a lack of better knowledge, etc. What, however, seen in the whole context, is explicit and explicit. But seen in the whole context, this could also be explicitly directed at myself, because I allow myself to call a spade a spade. In this respect, however, I have educated myself to always say openly what needs to be said or must be said, regardless of whether or not I am being attacked for it. For me, the principle of the sneaky, with their pretense and their wrong thinking and acting, does not apply. The fact that I also include myself in my explanation of making mistakes, because I too am only a human being, not all-knowing, not all-capable and someone who, like everyone else, has to learn all his life and is therefore also prone to making mistakes, is neither considered nor understood, and consequently insulting attacks are made on my person. This is because it is not understood that, in all honesty and dignity for my fellow human beings, I am not objecting to and attacking their person, not them as human beings and therefore in no way their personality, but only their wrong thoughts, their wrong belief in an imaginary God and their wrong character and values, actions, deeds as well as their wrong behavior. This is because, through all their actions and beliefs in this regard, they deceive themselves limitlessly, disadvantage themselves, inflict harm and misery on themselves and enslave themselves to a fantasy figure, thereby preventing themselves from shaping and leading their own lives, thinking and deciding for themselves, in order to be truly free in themselves, happy and content and truly human. This, which is never possible for a person who believes in God, because his faith prevents him from doing so and threatens him with death and the devil if he turns away from his delusion of God, begins to think, decide and act for himself and dares to live his life responsibly according to reality. And when someone tells them the truth, they do not dare to think about what is honestly said to them because of their fear of God, but they think that their personality and their will are attacked. Now, in this facts, too, it is written in such a way, as it is completely misrepresented, judged and handled in the whole of earthly psychology, that the character, the behavior, the action, the intellect, the reason as well as the whole psychological
way and manner
of man forms and represents his person, his humanity and his whole personality. But listen to what I read to you from this facts. The letter was beamed to Elizabeth on Monday, the 1st of February 2021 at 11:52.
As we have heard from Florina, the leaders of the states are not prescribing and implementing all that is necessary to contain the epidemic, but also, and by a large part at least of the European peoples, they are violating the emergency measures against the epidemic, which in themselves are already inadequate, resulting in many deaths.
True. Unfortunately, stupidity knows no boundaries, and the proverb that says,
"Through harm one becomes wise,"
is only true if the boundaries to stupidity were set so narrowly that stupidity would be prevented before it could even arise. However, it is useless to philosophize about this, because just as stupidity and incompetence are widespread among the majority of those in power, this is equally the case with a third of the population, which crosses over and also creates unrest among those of the population who are still acceptable or halfway sensible and also drives them to rebellion. Every smaller or larger measure of understanding and reason in relation to any matter requires a certain degree of intelligence, but if this is not present, as in the case of the necessary implementation and observance of safety precautions for the preservation of health against the danger of infection by the coronavirus, then all is lost, as we say proverbially, when all reasonable advice, talk and exhortation is unsuccessful.
Such behavior is inconsequential.
You say it, but logic can only be where the necessary intelligentsia is also present and consequently also values in relation to a functioning mind and clear reason. If, however, the intelligentsia of the majority of earthly rulers and earthlings is considered and taken under the intelligentum magnifying glass, then the frightening fact can be ascertained that the intelligentum, understanding and reason values are so deficient in many relationships that only ricochet, illogical behavior, wrong decisions, disadvantages, mischief as well as immense damage and even countless fatalities can result from it. And this is exactly the case with the corona epidemic, which could have been contained and prevented at the very beginning if the world's rulers and peoples had been capable of the necessary intelligence. However, since already at the beginning of the epidemic there was a lack of intelligence all over the world in the majority of all rulers and peoples, precisely with regard to the epidemic and the necessary measures to be taken, the epidemic disaster was able to spread as a pandemic and claim millions of lives.
And it seems to be continuing within this framework. What will develop further from this and for how long?
I see you are in the middle of a conversation, but greetings. My tour has taken longer than I had planned, which is why time has moved on and I cannot linger any longer. Therefore, I will only report briefly and say goodbye again immediately, but I will come and see you again tomorrow, Eduard. Goodbye.
Aha, greetings, my friend, and goodbye in a moment. But you, Zafenatpaneach, you were interrupted by a question.
Yes, I wanted to ask what will develop further from the epidemic and how long it will last.
Knowing this could change the mindset of the people's leaders, allowing them to take the necessary and appropriate measures against the plague, as well as the people to understand and adapt their behavior to it.
Something like this would perhaps be possible with other human beings, but not here with the God-believing earthlings, for they are neither accessible to rational statements nor to warnings and advice etc. Consequently, they are not willing to listen to those who think further than themselves and to follow their advice or take warnings seriously. The main reason for this is their belief in God, which works powerfully in them and lies to them that their non-existent God will certainly help them and save them. What is devilish about this is the fact that they neither perceive the delusion of God that they themselves have created and that dominates them, nor are they in any way aware of the delusion of faith that controls them, so that they allow themselves to be driven slavishly and dog-like by it, completely without resistance or will. Unfortunately, all believers in the delusion of God lack the intelligence that is not only lacking but effectively missing in this faith relationship, and thus also the most urgently needed understanding and the extremely important reason that would be necessary to perceive, recognize and also understand the real reality and its truth. As a result, contrary to the real reality and due to the believer's delusion of God, an inevitably wrong and damaging delusion results, which, however, is not perceived and not recognized in this way in a faith-enforced manner, but is wrongly evaluated as an effectively correct self-free decision.
It is always amazing to me how you know how to explain whatever it is in such detail and unambiguously.
Thank you. But you said that you wanted to say something about your clarifications, which came up or something.
It is true what Yanarara says, but you always immediately evade when we bring up something that concerns yourself and we are interested in it, like now with a thank you and saying that we want to explain something to you.
It's not important to talk about me, excuse me, just not when. Well, I mean, it's probably right and good to draw my attention to something when I mess up or something. But on the other hand...
It's not a puff piece as you once called it, but really just an observation worth mentioning. If you want to accept that, please do.
Good, thank you. Then we don't have to talk about it any further. Then you can get on to what you have to explain to me.
Not yet, for we have deviated from it concerning the plague, for we would like to know a little more about this in relation to what arises in the future in connection with the plague, for we know that you, together with Sfath, the father of,
as he informed us, observed what was to come.
Yes, that was the case, but I am not supposed to talk about it openly.
After all, we have nothing to do with the Earth's population and therefore cannot disseminate any information if you...
It's okay. Sorry to interrupt you again. Your objection is right, of course, which is why well, it's going to take some time.
We are not in a hurry.
Good. Then you can consult everything that has been said and explained so far with Ptaah, because he has the entire conversations in his records, and that since the beginning of the epidemic in November 2019. But also, what we have talked about so far today, and all that I am going to say even now, is automatically retrieved and recorded word for word, as has been the case since the very beginning of all contact conversations. Right from the very first conversation between Sfath and me, when I was still a little boy and he was not only a second father, best friend and teacher to me, but also a walking giant library of knowledge. So, following that everything is recorded, you can also retrieve it later if you ask to about it, because the responsibility for that falls on him. But now this. The time has become a little long. As usual, there will be another short night. But now I have talked enough, because now it is your turn to explain to me what important things you have to report.
Yes, that is correct. After all the years of our efforts, we have been able to fathom the cause of all the unpleasant disturbances that have occurred and continue to occur since the beginning of your settlement or residence in the center. Through our investigations back to the early days, We became aware of events that you had to endure and cope with in a way that we could never have imagined. Especially the incidents at the beginning of your activity in your new working space, which you call office. Through written records already made at that time, we have become aware of incidents that we considered to be bad humor when Sam Jace told us her experience that happened to her in your workroom and—
Sorry to interrupt you again. You're probably talking about the events that affected various other people in the same way and threw some of them completely off track?
Yes, and it must have been bad for everyone, because the resulting—
It's all right, don't talk about it, because no one understands and accepts these incidents as truth and as having happened unless they have been experienced themselves.
Sam Jace also explained this, but also that the whole thing had penetrated her consciousness in such a way and—
Yes, you don't have to go on, because I know what she explained to me in that regard as well. Yanarara, but you don't know that this event still causes her mental and emotional problems from time to time, because she first associated it with you before the whole thing could be clarified and resolved with the help of the A. Please tell us something about these incidents, which all of you who were involved in them, on Ptaah's advice, kept secret from all the other members so as not to frighten them. That was indeed the case, because apart from one thing that happened in the basement and the attic, all the people concerned said nothing about all the unpleasant things that kept happening in my office. Bad luck then that in the 1980s Professor Bender was also personally affected and thrown off course to such an extent that he withdrew completely from the center and said he would never enter my office again. I also had to promise him that I would not reveal anything about him in his lifetime.
That is what you did, as we know from Sam Jace. And as she told us, the reason for Professor Bender's visit was because he was interested in finding out whether your contacts with Sam Jace and the others were true or not.
Right, and for that afternoon Sam Jace and I had agreed that that is Sam Jace, me and Professor Bender, would meet in my office and then go on a sightseeing flight together. But Professor Bender was already here more than 4 hours early. And then the mishap in my office occurred. This caused him, apparently through his fright, which made his face white as lime, to go berserk and shout that I was in league with the devil and that he was leaving this evil place, never coming back and never entering my office again. As far as Sam Jace is concerned, I can well imagine that the incident at that time still bothers her. Because I can still remember very well her reaction at that time and how intensely the whole thing affected her, which was more or less also the case with everyone else, men and women alike, who, however, did not want to talk about it openly, but kept everything hushed up. Sam Jace then felt ashamed on top of everything because she considered what had happened stupid. We shouldn't talk about it. But because I experienced her reaction, as I did with others and even with Professor Bender, I can also imagine that. But it will not be possible to clarify this because the whole thing only ended in the mid-1990s when the A came here and were able to put an end to this unpleasantness, after which, however, the other terror began, which continues to this day. All these incidents could not be cleared up, in which Engelbert in particular was still involved, as a result of which he often felt compelled to show up with his loaded rifle when he came to my office, because he thought he could do something about it if he— well, you know from Sam Jace. Anyway, over the years, he would get a good shake in my office every time he came in. Similarly, something else happened in the attic day and night, but it wasn't a matter of noticeable physical attacks like in my office, but of nerve-wracking rumbling, which lasted so long that Engelbert ran up from his flat into the attic, even with a loaded rifle, which was useless against the rumbling forces. Then one day the little
wizards
came, the A, who found the place of origin and were able to put an end to the evil. Bernadette was also present at this action, who of course could not see the A.Nuelch herself, not even when she photographed them on the scene of the event, but it then turned out that she could at least capture a head with a helmet of an A on film, which we only saw, however, after the film had been developed and the photos had been taken. Hans Benz was also affected, as was Marcel Hurt, who, standing on a chair, mounted something on the office ceiling and was terrified when he then fell off the chair and broke his arm. Maria Wachter was also, but she was able to digest the matter. Then there were also Dr. Fraud, Grandma Rouse, Amartys Detta, as well as, but I don't know, it doesn't matter. But that wasn't all, because two others, whose names I can't remember, as well as a man, Hermann, Hoffman or something like that was his name. He was supposed to have held a higher position at the University of Vienna, came here and was affected in my office, whereupon he also disappeared in a flash, never came back and never let me hear from him again. Elsie Moser was also affected, several times, which she could not cope with, apart from everything else, which was the real reason why she left our group and emigrated to France, because she no longer dared to live in the center and come to my office, where she was attacked by
devil forces.
Because I was in league with the devil, etc., as she put it. Then last year one learned from Olga that Elsie had returned to Switzerland in the middle of 2018, was ill in a home somewhere in Lucerne and demanded to see me through Olga because, as I was told, she wanted to
clear the air
with me because I had not contributed anything to what had just happened in my office with her, etc. But there was also the last person to whom the same thing happened, namely Professor Hans Spender, a parapsychologist, who came to see me once in Hinwil and twice in the center, and who unfortunately also ended up in my office, because the same thing happened to him as to various others. The shock got into his bones, too, and he left my office in a hurry, shouting as he ran away that he would never come to the center again, that he would never enter my office again, that he didn't want to know anything about me or my contacts and that I should keep my mouth shut about him being with me. That is actually all I can tell you.
What you said is in line with what Semchase told.
Must, because it's nothing but the truth.
We do not doubt that either. But now we would like to know a little more about what you are allowed to say about the corona plague without coming into conflict with your obligation to remain silent.
Well, that will become known in the near future anyway, namely that the number of mutations is constantly increasing and that they are becoming more and more aggressive and thus more aggressive and deadly, and that they are spreading rapidly everywhere, on all continents. Earth humanity itself is to blame for this, first and foremost the inept rulers, because they do not prevent and prohibit all travel of any kind worldwide, while on the other hand that stupidly stupid part of the peoples is also very much to blame for everything as a result of cross-regulation. In addition, there are also great problems due to vaccinations with vaccines that are not fully developed or not sufficiently tested, which means that there will be deaths as well as late effects that will lead to death, suffering, illness or infirmity due to and after vaccinations. However, this is not mentioned, nor is the fact that despite vaccination of infected persons, they can continue to infect other people, nor can infections with the corona epidemic be avoided if unsuitable respirators are used or worn carelessly. On top of all the existing misery of the epidemic, there is the stupidity of their
experts,
who babble on with stupid and ridiculous talk about the corona epidemic and make themselves important when they are questioned journalistically for the information of the population. In addition, There are the stupidities and childishly ridiculous population misleading and inconsistent so-called case number spreads, moronic limit values and R values, which do not add up at all and give a completely false picture of the infection. If the course of the epidemic is observed, then it emerges since the end of July last year that the number of new infections with the corona epidemic virus has so far risen inexorably throughout the world and has already claimed, only what is publicly known, well over 110 million infected persons and 2.5 million fatalities. But hardly anyone from the peoples of all the 200 or so countries on Earth knows what all the nonsense of the figures, limits and the ridiculous shop talk of virologists, epidemiologists and other lologists means for the unstudied people, which is broadcast daily on TV and radio stations. Basically, the people do not understand everything that is said about numbers and figures, etc., about the incidence of infections and deaths, etc., in relation to the corona epidemic. Therefore, when I think about it, I come across the following important points.
1. The health authorities report daily how many people are newly infected with the coronavirus. These numbers of cases then go out into the world daily as current infection and fatality figures. Although this information is subject to strong fluctuations and cannot be regarded as effectively complete and reliable, because in addition to this information there is a high number of unreported cases that cannot be mentioned in any way.
2. If, in addition, the daily and weekly new infections are added together, then of course there are fluctuations in the infection and death figures from day to day and week to week, which are somehow simply balanced out, whereby a real trend cannot be effectively recognized.
3. The incidence, and I wonder if the average citizen even understands what is meant by this term, is the number of new infections or diseases in a group of people comprising a certain number of people during a certain period of time, calculated on the basis of the number of new infections per 100,000 inhabitants.
4. The so-called R value is the reproduction number, which indicates, theoretically, how many other people an infected person continues to infect. If the number of infections falls below 1, this means that the infectious disease, epidemic or pandemic is dissipating. If, on average, one infected person infects fewer than one other person, then the R value indicates that the number of infections is declining. However, the R value is uncertain because it usually indicates the infection incidence of days or weeks that have already passed or of a time that already belongs to the past.
5. If the number of active cases or the number of acutely ill people is taken for an epidemic, then it is easy to calculate how many of these proven infections lead to deaths. If the number of these fatalities is then subtracted from the number of those who have survived the epidemic and are considered to have recovered, the result obtained in this way in relation to all these active cases forms an important indicator or tool for assessing the health status of the population. It should be noted, however, that this value is only an approximate result, because not all infected persons can be recorded and there is an indeterminable number of unreported cases that cannot be recorded for various reasons, such as the fact that there is no obligation to report recovered persons, so their number is usually only estimated, which means that no exact number of active cases can be obtained.
Due to the irrationality, incompetence and stupidity of those in power, who still neither order nor enforce a worldwide travel ban of all kinds, the various new mutations, of which there will also be others, can spread worldwide, as has resulted from the outbreak formed since November and December 2019 up to a pandemic. So, In this respect, the new mutation virus that has emerged in the UK will spread very rapidly, and by the end of this month of February, compared to the corona species COVID-19 that has been raging since 2019, it will already reach a 30% spread beyond this one. Contrary to reason and rationality, the stupid rulers will listen to the clamoring of the business bosses, companies, corporations, traders, as well as hotel and inn operators and the countless small businesses of all kinds etc., who want to continue in the old framework and only seek money, earnings and profit. Basically, none of them cares if thousands or even tens of thousands of people are infected and die as a result of the epidemic, because all that matters to them is that their wallets ring. But this is equally true of the delusionists who have elevated themselves as representatives of God and who also want to hear their silver pockets ringing, so that they irresponsibly lure delusional believers into the temples of God at the expense of life and death and claim that their imaginary, non-existent God will hold his protective hand over them and protect them from infection, disease and death. This, on the one hand, because on the other hand, not only this kind of disaster arises, but also in the families themselves, which have to forfeit some of their external freedom due to a necessary lockdown, as a result of which the family members, who are addicted to pleasure, travel, sport and holidays, have to stay at home for safety's sake due to legal orders. But since this is extremely unfamiliar and the urge to go out and do all kinds of addictive habitual things cannot be fulfilled, quarrels arise among the family members, up to and including murder and manslaughter, as other degenerations are unleashed, such as rape, physical and psychological violence, as well as crime and delinquency, and so on. But again, back to what I have already said, one can hear again and again how the senseless demand the dismantling of the lockdown measures. Consequently, the irresponsible of the government then arrange for the whole thing to be relaxed again, after which the epidemic can start anew and claim many victims once more. There are also groups, circles, associations and organizations for everything that makes sense and makes no sense, for good and evil, for bad and stupid as well as for stupid and clever, and these know nothing better than to incite their members against all necessary safety precautions regarding the corona plague and thus spread countless infections that cause many deaths. This is further justified, as has already happened throughout the epidemic period, with the stupid argument that there is already a reduction in infections and deaths, which justifies a relaxation of the measures in this and that case. As I have already said, stupidity unfortunately know no bounds, especially in this regard among those in power, who are not only as dumb as a box of rocks, but also. But this must not be said openly. The various parties also play a part in this, each representing different interests and rising up in hostility against the other parties. Consequently, there is constant banter, backtalk and other imbecilic behavior and squabbles, as well as malicious discord and hatred in government business between the parties, creating an unhealthy and unpeaceful climate. It should be the same on our Earth planet as it was with the Pleiades, that no governing parties of any kind should be allowed, but that all rulers, no matter how many there are, must carry on the business of government without partisan grouping. In this way alone, each member of the government would have to give his or her personal opinion, according to his or her own ability and discretion, for decisions to be taken, and this clearly without any party influence. And this happens in this way, because there is no party, consequently no influence and no requirement dictates and demands all motions, requests and demands, but are absolutely determined by a self-decision. However, What still needs to be said or explained with regard to the corona epidemic? Everything has already been said since the epidemic emerged in November 2019, including the fact that the epidemic was already spread from a laboratory in southeast China after mid-1979, but you obviously do not know that. So I will briefly explain that its origins can be traced back to sheer evil hatred of an American, who joined forces with Chinese leader Mao Zedong, who was also quite viciously ambitious against the US, whereby a plan was hatched to create a deadly virus that would then be released in the US to get revenge for something. As I said about this, the first precursor of the virus was unintentionally released as early as after the mid-1970s, has mutated some 5,000 times up to the present time, and then in its first rampant form as of January 2019, has already claimed victims all over the world who have fallen ill, with many already dying from it, and without the disease being recognized. Consequently, the deaths of many people have been attributed to other diseases. However, when in November 2019, the coronavirus was dragged out of a secret laboratory in Wuhan in China by infected laboratory technicians as yet another new and more dangerous mutation, it was able to start spreading very quickly across the entire planet and become a pandemic. This, while the previous form subsided very quickly and simply dissipated, but I can't say anything about that because I don't know what happened and how that was possible. The coronavirus variation, however, which was already spread in November 2019 and took millions of victims, was thus, as I said, only detected in December 2019, but was in the same way as before already mutated higher again. And this virus, which has already claimed many lives so far, is expanding the death toll even more, and it is doing so by mutating further and becoming more aggressive and deadly. But it is pointless and useless to say anything more about this, which is why I only want to repeat some things that have already been explained several times, but which I will not write down again when I recall this passage of the conversation. I will begin with this. What I have explained corresponds to everything that has already been discussed, said and explained about all the corona time. Consequently, I now want to appeal to you once more. What special things you want to tell me, as you have indicated.
Thank you for all your explanations and information which gives us a clear understanding of the whole of this COVID-19 epidemic.
Yes, thank you, Edward. For our part, Yanarara can now explain to you what we have been able to fathom.
What we have to explain in terms of information is really extremely unpleasant, and this is because, at least at the present time, there is no possibility whatsoever for us to change anything for the better or to do anything to stop the harmful effects. The entire cause of all disturbances corresponds to forces that were hitherto completely unknown to us, which was the reason why we have spent all the last 22 years, during which we have endeavored again and again to find the causes and modes of action for all the attacks, disturbances and the resulting damage that affect you and your work. By an unexpected coincidence it has now come about that us sonic scientists have discovered the origin of all the causes mentioned, which are founded in forces that were hitherto completely unknown to us and which everywhere, where they develop and spread, cause powerful, serious and degenerating disturbances, influences and dangerous abnormalities, confusions and effects. Basically, these dangerous forces correspond in their malignant degenerations, their very evil and completely uncontrollable malignant effects to a power that is degenerated and degenerated in its kind to such a degree that it,
in our opinion, if I may express it in place of Yanarara, corresponds not only to an extremely bad impoverishment and confusion of the ability to think, as well as to a pathological atrophy of consciousness of not only an uncontrollable imagination, but also to an unholy delusion of faith, an uncontrollable imagination that rejects everything real, over which the person who has fallen prey to it has no control whatsoever. The whole of this religious delusion was completely unknown to us in its effect, because all faith is alien to us. Consequently, we only deal with the absolutely creation-given reality or reality and its irrefutable truth, but never with assumptions, presumptions, or a belief and...
Excuse me, but an assumption or conjecture, which are hypotheses, are basically nothing more than a belief, regardless of whether it is religious, sectarian, or so-called universal.
That is undeniably true. Consequently, we do not allow ourselves to be distracted by confused appearances. So we have also made an effort all these last years with regard to the clarification of all strange and damaging incidents in your working space, in which also other persons than you were involved, who had to complain about unpleasant experiences. But just as we have always been concerned about your person, your work and your working equipment only according to reality, this, while at the same time during the 2 decades we worked on inventions for new equipment, which we were prompted to do by certain findings and on which a total of almost 300 people worked. This resulted in new inventions that made us realize which forces caused and continue to cause everything, without us having found ways so far to put an end to the evil that is so distressing for you, because we have never dealt with this matter, did not know it, and therefore do not know how, where and what we had to research. Consequently, we did not have any knowledge in this regard, but could only now, through completely new sonaric equipment of physical optoelectronic apparatus research means, fathom out what is happening around you and around your working apparatus to this day. Now, however, we have been able to gain completely new insights into what I have already mentioned, namely that the delusion of faith of the entire believing mass of earthly mankind is the cause of all evil occurrences in your working space and on your working apparatus. Our findings show that without doubt the religious faith of the mass of humanity effectively corresponds to the authorship of all the evils. This religious delusion of faith of mankind creates tremendous energetic forces, through whose vibrations the faith-stricken people around the planet are continuously influenced and bound to their faith. And this happens continuously day and night without interruption, whereby the forces affect the whole of humanity and they are continuously afflicted by the powerful belief-related delusional force vibrations, without people being able to defend themselves against it and, moreover, having no idea whatsoever about the whole thing. In this energy of faith all forms of faith and their energies of all religions and sects are united, because their forms of energy of faith are all of the same kind and consequently unite with each other indiscriminately. In this way, these powerful energies span the earth, continuously transmitting the power of their energy vibrations to humanity and constantly infesting it. As a whole, the forces of faith form such a concentrated power as we cannot find any other on the earth as a whole, and nothing can be done to oppose it. Consequently, its power spreads and has an unrestrained effect over the whole earth. This means that the evil of this energy of faith is concentrated against everything that is opposed to it and destroys everything that is opposed to it. These religious and sectarian forces of faith have developed independence and viciously attack you, seek to destroy you and seek to push you out of life. This, on the one hand, while, on the other, they have become capable of obstructing and disturbing your work, also in relation to solid matter, such as technology, and in this connection I mention your computer apparatus, on which these malignant forces of faith energy act and make your work largely impossible on an ongoing basis. The purpose of this malignant work of these degenerated religious faith energy forces is, this is how we see and judge it, that you should be forced by these religious faith energy forces to end and abandon your work and mission.
So that's where the wind is blowing from. But that won't work, because as mean as everything is and as evil as it may seem against me and my work, I also have a hard head in this respect and I don't give up. So I do equally as in the relationship that I simply ignore all the stupid antagonists who call me names, call me liars and cheat, impute mendacious things to me out of hatred, slander me and threaten me. In no way will I bow to these sectarian energies of faith, because I have an obligation to fulfill and I will not be dissuaded from it under any circumstances. Therefore, despite the attacks, lies and slander, as well as the hatred against me by all the malicious adversaries, I do not refrain from my work, just as I do not refrain from the malicious attacks and disturbances of these belief energies and their forces hindering my work. And as for all the antagonists who want to harm me, they harm themselves through their stupidity and make themselves impossible and hated all around the world, as I get to read and hear again and again from all over the world, where various antagonists, especially from Switzerland, make themselves hated through lying films, lying emails, hate and lying interviews as well as stupid writings etc. Many times I have to read and hear on the phone that these stupid elements are to have their necks broken or otherwise very bad things are to be done to them if they fall into the hands of certain people.
I have read such writing from you and also overheard conversations, but that you do not respond to it is probably what is right. But I have not yet said all that I have to say. What I have explained relates both to the thoughts, feelings and psyche of human beings, whereby, however, those persons are particularly affected by these energy forces to a very great extent who correspond to the decidedly religiously adversarial believers and are consequently perceived and attacked by the world-encompassing faith energy block, as is the case with you. Therefore, you are being attacked banefully, perniciously, destructively and malignantly by these religious faith energy forces, as well as being prevented from doing your work fluently by interference with your work and work apparatus. I know from studies that the fact of energetic vibrational effects of a subtle nature cannot be established with earthly measuring and recognition techniques, and consequently their existence is denied by the sciences contrary to truth and reality. All subtle energies that cannot be predominantly measured by earthly sciences correspond to forms of energy that man does not know in nature and in relation to its physical processes. Consequently, they simply do not exist for him. All very diverse subtle energies, for which there is still no scientifically recognized method of recording in the earthly sciences, are therefore simply denied and disputed. These subtle energies, however, have certain vibrations and powers that can possibly be consciously perceived by so-called clairvoyant, clairsentient and highly sensitive people, but which they usually keep quiet about because they are ridiculed, as you know very well, but which we do not have to talk about. Unconsciously, these powerful energies are active in every human being and influence his or her well-being and everyday life. You know from your own experience, as I know, that these subtle energies and their vibrations and forces can cause a variety of problems and effects, and this is also due to what we have been researching for a long time in relation to you and your work, etc. Yanarara and I know this. Yanarara and I know this very well, and for everyone's understanding, since you publish our conversations, I would like to explain some connections in more detail and clarify that the human body corresponds to an energetic field, which is embedded in energetic fields on different levels. Basically, The human body produces, e.g. through food, various energies, also physically verifiable for the earthly sciences, which it needs and consumes for the use and function of its entire organism. Non-stop, the nerve pathways transmit electrical impulses, called ECG, to the cells of the entire organism, which is physically measurable. This, however, while other energetic energies and fields exist, which, however, cannot yet be measured with earthly techniques, because they exist on another level and are of a subtle nature. The knowledge of these subtle energies has been known to us players for thousands of years and is listed and explained in all our teachings as very important life factors, namely,
knowledge to sustain life.
These teachings describe the meridian system of the whole organism, as well as the subtle energy centers, and the necessity of these energies and their powers to maintain health and heal the whole body and consciousness. And these teachings also show that basically these subtle energies and their forces keep the whole energy field of the human being in balance as well as himself. And these subtle energies are also decisive for physical and consciousness health. So the well-being of the body is controlled by these subtle energies, whereby all the different subtle fields that overlap and are in constant exchange with each other also exert a great influence on the emotional behavior and mental state of the human being. Together with the physical body, the subtle energies shape the human existence and thus his life, his working and being, and the constitution. The subtle vibration and the subtle condition of the human being depend strongly on the moral and mental and emotional condition in which he finds himself, because every nerve, every organ, every cell and every muscle is of importance for the fact that through their energy, vibration and power the whole organic as well as consciousness condition vibrates in the right way. That should still be said. What now remains to be explained is the following with regard to delusion and the energy of belief. In other words, religious belief in a deity, etc., is a pathological delusion that dominates consciousness and completely makes it impossible for the intellect and reason to realize the possibility of recognizing an imagination and a delusion. Only subconsciously, but then in the course of time, fantasies developed through this delusion of belief, which led to vivid, graphic images, which are pathologically stored in the consciousness in terms of thought, feeling, psychology and become mania. The result is that it is no longer possible to distinguish between real reality and imagination or delusion, fantasy and illusion, and therefore, according to the delusion, the all-pervasive and foregrounding delusion of belief is considered real reality and truth and is morbidly, if I may use one of your terms, brainlessly championed. This is something that corresponds to the fact of the entire delusional bulk of earthly humanity, because the whole of this malignant power arises from its delusion of religious sectarian faith. And this takes place in such an uncontrollably degenerated manner that the entire earth-encompassing religion sectarian believing mass of humanity is not given any self-liberal possibility whatsoever to use its consciousness as well as its intellect and reason by its own power in such a way that beyond its delusion even a single impulse is able to arise with regard to a thought that is able to critically deal with its belief in God and its religion. Sectarian delusion. This means that the pathological believers in God are prisoners and slaves of their delusion, from which they cannot escape by their own strength, but are helplessly at its mercy and, moreover, incapable of perceiving or even recognizing their enslavement to faith as well as the effective truth of real reality.
In summary, the ominous fact arises that through the religious and sectarian faith of earth humanity in a creator God and all the further holy figures imagined in connection with this faith, a dangerous and powerful energy of faith has arisen, to which the entire earth-wide humanity, addicted to a faith in God, has fallen prey and is helplessly at the mercy of this energy. This dangerous energy of faith, which we have only been able to detect and recognize after about 3 decades, and which impairs the intellect, reason and intelligence, prevents any possibility of a real capacity of thought in earthly man with regard to the ability to grasp an impulse for a logical train of thought worthy of consideration with regard to a recognition, grasp and understanding of the fundamental reality and truth of all existential values given by creation. This means that every earthly human being who has fallen prey to a religious or sectarian faith is dominated by a conceit and a delusion from which he can no longer free himself as a result of a blockage triggered by the delusion. Consequently, as an unwilling slave of his delusional belief in God, he is forced by this belief to neither deal with the effective reality, the reality, nor with the only reality truth given in this reality.
Every kind of faith corresponds to a thoughtlessly adopted assumption of a speech act with regard to a statement, assertion and affirmation etc., which demands a compelling assurance with the claim to an agreement, which claims a contradictionless, unhesitating and compellingly demanding validity with regard to the content of the uttered statement, assertion and affirmation etc., and which, moreover, allows neither a questioning and examination, nor a diverse exchange of opinions or doubts. But this means nothing other than that the human being is forced to conform to an imagination and thus to a delusion or delusion of faith, whereby he has to submit to a forced faith and to deal with it. This faith then stirs him up in consciousness to such an extent that an urge develops in him from it, which compulsorily and permanently drives him steadily to deeper faith and demands that he go on and on with his delusion of faith, against which he can no longer defend himself, because his faith has already become a hopeless delusion, from which he can no longer free himself, but sinks deeper and deeper into it until he is without salvation, and a detachment from the delusion of faith is no longer possible, and he even goes to his death for it, because he is driven to it by the delusion of faith, which makes him believe that his faith is the truth.
Unfortunately, we are called and have to go back. We have to say goodbye.
It's a shame. Now we were in good shape with this important topic.
We can continue that later. If we are called, then.
It seems urgent. Goodbye, Eduard.
Good. Goodbye, also to you, Yanarara. Goodbye everyone.
Goodbye.